Last week we discussed the classical and canonical version of the ethic of connection and responsibility in the teachings of Confucius. And today the theme is the contemporary counterpart to that ancient ethic and the different forms that it may take. So we have a problem in the study of this ethic that we didn't have in the study of the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. The ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity has its ideologists in the 19th century and today, whereas the ethic of connection and responsibility, the other ethic that we're studying, has its strongest formulation 2,500 years ago. So it presents us a very different problem. And it's part of our task then to imagine what its most powerful contemporary form might be, but in imagining its contemporary form, to recognize the diversity of directions that it might take. And that, therefore, is my project in these opening remarks. Now, first, a word about the central message of this ethic of connection as we might interpret its meaning today. The central message is that at the end of the day, all we have is one another. Intersubjectivity, the sacred logic of the interpersonal, is the most sacred element in our experience, according to this view. It's not a collectivist view over against an individual view. It's a view which asserts the primacy of the fundamental moral logic of the interpersonal, you and me. Joint intentionality, what we do together, what we create together, what we produce by reason of our togetherness, is the fundamental theme in this ethic. And the view is that that interpersonal connection is the ultimate source in our experience of both meaning and value. It is a logic that is perpetually subject to the risk of perversion. And the exemplary form of its perversion is when the other is treated as a means to an end, when we manipulate him, when we fail to revere and respect him, to attend to his needs, and to imagine him, to imagine the otherness of the other. This is the great theme of this ethic, and all the debates have to do with the direction that it may take with respect to both the organization of society and the conduct of life. Now, the philosophical background to this ethic is not, I think, fundamentally different from the philosophical background of the other ethic that we studied. And the view that, to my mind, would be most conducive to it, most appropriate to its intentions, is again another version of that temporal naturalism that I took to be the best possible background of the other ethic. The world is real, time is real. Our subjectivity is obscure. And our ordinary experience of interpersonal connection has more potential of value than everything that we consider noble or special or extraordinary. It is another way to vindicate the priority of the ordinary, of ordinary humanity and its experience, but locating the source and center of value in the interpersonal rather than in the experience of the isolated individual. Once again, however, this ethic, like the other one, bears the marks of the dust of history. Its contingent association with different peoples and civilizations in the world. And the closest association is its association with the country that is now one of the two superpowers in the world, China. So just as the ethic of nonconformity and self-fashioning bears the marks of its association with American culture, so this ethic, in its most conventional forms, bears the marks of its association with China. And there are four aspects or four elements of this dust of history that I want to emphasize. So the first is the question of whether it has, or in what sense it has, an idea of transcendence. In the West, and in the formulation of the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, the idea of transcendence, the idea of the infinitude of the individual self, of the spirit, has had two main forms. One form has been in the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the radical transcendence of the creative and redemptive God over the world. And we can ask, what is the counterpart to this idea of transcendence, this idea that everything in our experience points beyond itself, that there is always more in us than in all the conceptual and social worlds that we build and inhabit, that they are finite in relation to us and we are infinite in relation to them. What is the counterpart to that idea in this second ethic that we're now studying? You could say there is a counterpart, but it's a counterpart that presents the idea of transcendence less clearly and radically drawn. The counterpart is the idea that the moral logic of the interpersonal, which I just described as the source of meaning and value in this ethic, transcends all the particular ways in which society may be organized, all our particular arrangements in historical time. But that idea of a sacred archetype of the interpersonal underlying all the forms of social life presents the conception of transcendence less starkly and less radically than the ones to which we are accustomed in the religions and philosophies of the West. The second element of the dust of history is what I could call familism. That the object of devotion and the most natural anchor or place in which this logic of the interpersonal is manifest is the family. And this is what I'm calling familism. Now, one might say that in the West, given the halfway house of between belief and unbelief, the fact that many want to believe who don't believe, that faith is a desire and that they have often a sentimental attitude toward faith, familism is also a powerful force. And in many of the actual popular expressions of religious experience in the West, including in the history of the Semitic monotheisms, a relentless critic might say that the real object of devotion is the family. But this object of devotion is concealed or sublimated in different forms. But in this tradition, it's manifest. And there is always the underlying danger that the ancient formula, the moral formula of so many historical societies may come back. The formula that I described as the mixture in the same social relations of exchange, power, and affect. the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. The third element of the dust of history is meritocracy. All the agrarian bureaucratic empires of antiquity developed in one form or another a professional staff around the imperial center. So all of them had, at least in an incipient form, this meritocratic idea of the capabilities necessary for service to the public. But in China, this idea was developed in the most extensive form in comparison to all of the other agrarian bureaucratic empires. And the fourth element of the dust of history is maybe the most intangible, which is a rigid view or a stark view of the contrast between order and anarchy. The Chinese Empire, always threatened by invasion from the Eurasian steppe and by disintegration or rebellion from within, the ruling circles of the society of the country have always been threatened by an excessively rigid view of order and of the contrast between order and anarchy, and unwilling to do what many of us have tried to do in the course of Western history, which is to split the difference between order and anarchy, and to imagine a form of order which is open to correction from within and is an organized anarchy, if you like. And you see that the influence of that reluctance to admit a synthesis of order and anarchy, even in the views of the present Chinese regime, which, terrified of following the example of Gorbachev, has now ended up as Brezhnev. So it's another version of the same problem of this excessively rigid contrast of order and anarchy. So what should we do with this dust of history? We should get rid of it. We should shake off the dust of history and try and describe and develop this second ethic in a way which is as free as possible of the influence of these historical associations. Because as with the other forms, which are corrupted or diminished by their association with certain peculiarities of American culture, this ethic too is diminished and degraded by its association with these contingent features of Chinese history. Now, what then is the core of the ethic, aside from the assertion of the primacy of the interpersonal? The core is an idea of reciprocity. And the idea of reciprocity is most classically formulated in the Golden Rule. As we mentioned last week, the Golden Rule in its positive form, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which Christ stated, and its negative form, which Confucius stated, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Now, Michael last week described the classical Confucianist form of this ethic in a way which emphasized the rules of certain rituals. And I want to now remark on how I interpreted his description then of the meaning of these rituals, their goal and their relation to the norm of reciprocity. So I interpreted these rituals as having three goals. The first goal is to serve as a dramatic enactment of the norm of reciprocity. By changing roles, the parent changing roles with the son and so forth, we actually act out the norm of reciprocity. The second goal is to break the compulsions, the tropisms that besiege our moral experience. By acting out a form of life different from the role that we actually occupy, the role that the other occupies, we start to break these habits. And that then leads to the third goal, which is ideally the aim is to have a system of roles which is open to correction, which is corrigible, and which is therefore able to reflect more fully and authentically the potential of the logic of the interpersonal, that be capable of revision, and because it be capable of revision, it also be capable of progress. So I see this description of the rituals as converging with the claim that I'm now making. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that the norm of reciprocity, as it applies both to the conduct of life and to the organization of society, is both indeterminate and incomplete. It's indeterminate in the sense that its practical implications are always unclear and subject to dispute. And it's incomplete because it doesn't do all of the work that we expect a moral conception, a conception of how to live, to work. The norm of reciprocity, in order to be tangible and to give us definite direction, both in our lives and in the organization of society, has to be translated, for example, into a series of normative pictures of what the relations of life should look like in each domain of social life. So there's one domain of the family, there's a domain of the government and its relation to its subjects or citizens, there's a domain of economic life, and so forth. And this collection of these normative images, these prescriptive models of what relations among people can and should look like in different domains of social life, is what would be necessary to give practical substance and effect to the norm of reciprocity. The norm of reciprocity applies both phylogenetically, that is, in our collective evolution, and ontogenetically, in the evolution of the individual. So we can interpret it as having great power and influence in the formation of the child as the child becomes an adult, but also in the formation of society. And in attempting to give it a contemporary expression, we're not totally at a loss. We have the assistance of the main tradition of modern sociology, represented by social theorists like Durkheim and Tönnies. And we have also the support of cognitive and evolutionary psychology, which studies in detail the sources and the effects of the norm of reciprocity, both in the development of society and in the development of the individual. Now, at that point, I want to claim in our argument today that the ethic of connection and responsibility, informed by this moral logic of the individual, this moral logic of the interpersonal, by our need to recognize, respect, and revere the other, can take two directions. And there are two criteria by which these directions are distinct from each other. I'm going to call one of these directions the minimalist direction, and the other direction the maximalist direction. The two directions, the minimalist and the maximalist, are different by two connected criteria. One criterion has to do with the extent to which they accept as their template the present organization of society. Are they, for example, a way to humanize the existing order of society, or are they an invitation to transform that order? That's the first criterion. Their relation to the established structure and the established ideology of society. Is it that they attempt to put a human face on this order, as social liberalism and social democracy now do politically in the West and in the world? Or do they demand for their implementation structural change in the basic institutional framework and the ideological assumptions associated with it? The second criterion by which the minimalist and the maximalist direction differ from each other is the extent to which they recognize the contradictory character of the self and the assumptions, the presuppositions of selfhood. Now, earlier in the course, I spoke to this idea of the assumptions of our selfhood in three domains: the relation of the self to the other, the relation of the self to a social world, and the relation of the self to itself. And I said that, and I argued in favor of a richer conception of selfhood than the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity now has, one that would recognize these contradictions. So remember, what are the contradictions? First, with respect to the relation of self to other, we need to connect, but every connection threatens us with a loss of freedom and personal distinction. How can we connect without being subjugated? That's what we would want. So the question is, does the form of the ethic of connection and responsibility that we would develop today on the basis of this historical legacy recognize or not this contradiction? The second contradiction is the relation of the self to a social world. In order to affirm selfhood, develop selfhood, we must engage. We can't be isolated. No one is free, I said before, in the forest. But every engagement in a real social world seems to exact as the price of engagement our surrender to that world. So to be free, to have a self, to develop a self, we would have to be able to engage without surrendering, to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. That's the second contradiction. And the third contradiction is in the relation of the self to itself. To be free, we must develop a way of being in the world, a character, a set of habits, an orientation in the world. But there's always the threat that this habitual way of being may be crystallized or rigidified, that may become a mummy that sucks the life out of us. So to be free, we have to be able to form this way of being, this character, but also to have the power to disrupt it from within. And this combination of forming the habit or the character and exerting the power of disruption is then the third contradiction, which the maximalist form of the ethic of connection would have to develop, and I want to argue the minimalist one lacks. Now, the two criteria are in fact connected, because the recognition of these contradictory conditions of selfhood is immediately connected to the interest in defying and reforming the arrangements of society and creating a society which, in different ways, allows us to connect with others without being subjugated. So we have an experience of connection without subjugation in personal love. And the question is, what is the counterpart to personal love in life among strangers. It's some form of cooperation among free and equal individuals. But the actual institutional form of that cooperation is always the subject of a contest in social life, in history. So too, how can we be free in the sense of being both insiders and outsiders, of being able to engage without surrendering? It depends on the way society is organized. Society must allow us to engage without surrendering. It must allow us to refuse the last word to the social order and keep the last word for ourselves and have this power of reinvention. And that depends on the actual political and economic organization of society. So a high-energy democracy is more conducive to that than the weak democracies that we have in the world today. A knowledge economy for the many is more conducive than the command and control forms of economic life that we had under Fordist mass production, or that we continue to have in the knowledge economy for the few, which is what we today have. And finally, the ability to reinvent oneself, and therefore one's character, one's habit, to break out of the money, is a goal that the arrangements of social life may either favor or make more difficult. Now, this contrast between the minimalist and the maximalist arises in three domains, or with respect to three focal points. To the three problems that classical social theory studied. Actually, it studied only two of the three, because the third is one that it didn't really study, or studied only marginally. The first problem is the problem of subjugation. Subjugation would be, for the ethic of connection, a perversion, the exemplary perversion in which the other who we are supposed to revere and recognize becomes then a means to the end of the advancement of our interests. And its characteristic form in modern societies is radical inequality, resulting in the oppression that the few exercise over the many. Now, what is the response of the minimalist form of an ethic of connection to this? The response, as exemplified by contemporary social democracy, institutionally conservative social democracy, or social liberalism, has two characteristic parts. One is to diminish inequality by compensatory and retrospective redistribution through progressive taxation or through redistributive social entitlements. Creating, therefore, a secondary distribution. So it's not changing the original or primary distribution of advantage and opportunity. It's creating a second distribution through governmental power. And the other is meritocracy, which clings to the class system or is synthesized with the class system rather than subverting it. And those would be the main elements of the minimalist response to the problem of subjugation. The maximalist response to the problem of subjugation requires the structural transformation of both the economy and the state. So its form today would be the creation of a knowledge economy for the many that would replace what we have, the knowledge economy for the few. An experimental, innovative knowledge economy that would give agency, economic agency, to the ordinary human being. That would take the majority of humanity, which is now this subjective petty bourgeoisie, it's poor, it's disorganized, and its horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. It aspires by default to antiquated, unproductive, isolated family business, and offered another option. And in the political realm, it would create a form of democracy that in fact contradicts the class system, that weakens path dependency, the influence of the past over the future, and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead, and that makes transformation easier to come by without having crisis as its enabling condition. A high-energy democracy. So the claim is, and you can add other elements, like an alternative form of education, an alternative way of providing public services. So the difference with respect to the problem of subjugation between the minimalist and the maximalist approach has to do with whether we change or not, we defy or not the original distribution of advantage and opportunity, or simply by structural change, by change of the institutions and of the ideological assumptions, or instead try simply to create a secondary distribution that coexists with the primary distribution. Now, the second problem, which was the main concern of the central tradition of classical social theory, is the problem of disunion. So the modern societies advance, they become more complicated, they create wealth, and in so doing, they create the danger that society will lose its cement, the glue that binds its different parts together, and is the practical basis for solidarity, a supreme concern of the ethic of connection. The minimalist response to the problem of disunion is the emphasis on an ethic of roles. And this was already true in the case of the classical social theory, of Durkheim's theories, of Tönnies' theories, imagining that functional interdependence, the technical division of labor, is the basis of social union. But as Durkheim and Tönnies recognize, it's not enough. It has to be supplemented by a solidaristic orientation in society. And this solidaristic orientation, so that it not be just an ideology floating impotently over the reality of social life, has to have a basis in our engagement in the actual intermediate organizations that exist in society, the actual communities, the actual professional associations. It's not just the state and the individual. In between the state and the individual, there are the intermediate bodies. And our participation in those bodies is, according to the minimalist view, the source of the necessary solution to the problem of disunion. The maximalist says a form of connection, of union, that is dependent on antecedent sameness is always weak. The strongest form of union is the one that we can create, as it were, from scratch. And how do we increase social capital, associational density? By bringing people together who are not antecedently united because they were of the same race or same religion or same class, and joining them together in purposive action joint new action to create new things, to create novelty in the world, is the basis of social union according to the maximalists. An ethic of responsibility is not enough. Like the old motto of Harvard Business School, make profit with a conscience. That's not enough. The only real source of social union has to be joining in purposive action. Examples. One could say a principle of mandatory social service as an alternative to military service. Everyone serves the other at some point in his working life. An alternative way of organizing the provision of public services. The state operates at the floor with a universal minimum assured to all of the citizens of public services, and it operates at the ceiling in the development of the costliest and most innovative services, but in the broad middle area between the floor and the ceiling, the state engages civil society as its partner in the experimental and competitive provision of public services. It's not the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. It's civil society assuming the task of creating its own future through its non-for-profit participation as a partner of the state, through cooperatives of health workers, education specialists, and so forth. In other words, rather than assuming that social capital association is a constant, we take it as a variable, as something that we can build. Now finally we come to the third problem. And the third problem is the one which classical social theory did not recognize, or recognize only at the margin. The third problem is the problem of coldness. And to the extent that it's recognized at all, it's recognized only in ideas like Max Weber's idea of charisma. These modern societies, these functionally differentiated societies, are, in addition to being disunited and oppressive, cold. There are societies in which affect has been privatized. The sublime is privatized in the life of the individual and of the family. Exchange and power are separated. Exchange goes to the market. Power goes to politics. And affect is imprisoned within the family. Now, in many societies, the extreme case is a slave society, the classic formula was to combine in the same relations exchange, unequal exchange, power, the superior, the beneficiary of the exchange, the master of the slave is the one who benefited, and affect. The ideology of slavery was we're one big happy family. And what can be in a free society, in a society that emancipates people, what can be the source of warmth? Where does the heat come from? If the heat is not a radiation of family life, where does it come from? That's the problem. Now, the minimalist solution to this, to the extent that there is a minimalist solution, I think still is that there's some radiance of family affect that goes beyond the family to the larger life of society and may be sustained by other ideologies like nationalism. We're all one people, we have one project, and so forth. But the real source is the affluence, the extension of this family affect to the larger life of society. My view is that the heat has to come from a radically different source. The heat has to come from the imagination. It's not the affect. It's not a diluted form of family affect, but it's the life of the imagination, creating the new, the experimental. So what is the imagination? Return. The imagination has two moves. One move is distancing from the phenomenon. The other move is to subsume the phenomenon under a range of variations. To understand something is to imagine it as a variant of other things that might be in the realm of the adjacent possible. How do we understand anything? We understand it by understanding how it can change, or how we can change it, the theirs to which we can get from here. And the institutional projects of a freer society than the society we have, like a high-energy democracy or a knowledge economy for the many, would be the practical institutional instruments for the creation of the new. The knowledge economy has as its business the creation of the new, the perpetual creation of the new. And a high-energy democracy is devoted to the development of the novelty in social life, especially those novelties that are incompatible with the structures of class. That's where the heat comes from. The heat comes from the practical embodiment of the imagination. Now, I want to make a general remark about where this is going that will be related to the discussions we could have in this and in the next class, and that go to the question of whether there can be a synthesis or not between these two ethics: the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, and the ethic of connection and responsibility. But the corrected form of the ethic of self-fashioning is the form that would emerge from our criticism of it. And remember the criticisms. I said it had an impoverished idea of selfhood. It didn't recognize the contradictions of selfhood. It had no political horizon. It had no politics except an unacceptable politics, which is the politics of an inventive elite confronting a horde of conformists. It was vitiated by Prometheanism, a refusal to recognize the fragility and finitude of the human being, and it had an empty conception of autonomy. It wants to be total radical autonomy, but for what? With what content? To what end? So out of those criticisms would emerge a different conception of this ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. And after all, our aim in this discussion is not to criticize a series of straw men. Our aim is to give each of these ethics the strongest possible form that we can create, so that the result of our work be an evolution, so that we be choosing among the best alternatives rather than among the weakest alternatives. Similarly, what emerges from the contrast between the minimalist and the maximalist versions of the ethic of connection is, to my mind, a stronger form of the ethic of connection. The maximalist version of the ethic of connection is much closer to the corrected form of the ethic of self-fashioning than the uncorrected form is to the minimalist form. The minimalist version of the ethic of connection is wide apart from the uncorrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning. Now, does the maximalist version of the ethic of connection then converge with the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning? I don't think so. I think that they don't converge, and that in their failure to converge, they continue to exemplify a lasting duality in our moral experience and in our moral consciousness. The nature of this duality would be interpreted differently from the perspective of the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning and from the perspective of the maximalist version of the ethic of connection. The very meaning of their failure to converge would be different in these two registers, but they wouldn't be the same because there's still all the differences that I listed at the end of our discussion of the ethic of self-fashioning. In the ethic of self-fashioning, even under the corrected vision, at the end of the day, the incarnate individual is the source. The incarnate individual on the way to death. The fundamental idea remains that there's more possibility, there's more life in the individual or in the human race than there is in all the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. An idea of radical transcendence, of infinity. They have a different relation, the maximalist version of the ethic of connection and the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning to the project of world revolution, the project that has put the world on fire over the last 3 centuries. I said, the history of the ethic of self-fashioning is inseparable from the history of this world revolution. Its history and the history of that revolution are part of the same thing. The ethic of connection, even in its maximalist form, has no such internal connection to the revolutionary project. It's not necessarily against it, but it's not part of it. And they differ finally in their attitude to the disruptors and the disruptor and the practice of disruption. For the ethic of self-fashioning, even under its corrected form, the disruptors are the salt of the earth. The ethic of connection, even modified, augmented, criticized, transformed, has reason to suspect that under the pretense of disruption and rebellion lurks the poison of self-aggrandizement. And I want to conclude by the following reflection. One of the things that is most disturbing in the sequence of ideas that I've just traversed is the role of temperament in the choice. For example, in the choice between the minimalist and the maximalist versions of the ethic of connection. Remember how this came up before in our discussion of Schopenhauer. I said, Schopenhauer says in the preface to his masterwork, my philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence. Then he says in Parerga and Paralipomena, a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. These things can't both be true, I said. And now it comes up again in this context. And I want to offer, in order to show what's difficult and disconcerting about it, my own experience. So I was a revolutionary by temperament before I became a revolutionary by conviction. My parents admonished me to abandon my maximalism and to be reasonable. But I rejected their admonitions. Now that I'm an old man, I can recognize and I've come to accept the fate of my temperament. and to embrace the advice given by a Portuguese writer, José Saramago. The older, the freer, and the freer, the more radical. However, unlike some people, I struggle not to mistake temperament for truth. And I can report to you that the experience of this struggle and its results are not satisfactory.
Wonderful. Let us open this up for conversation. Please.
I have a question about what you were talking about with familism and how there's this attempt to anchor the ethic of connection.
In the dust of history, yes.
And so, in an ancient context, what would qualify as family is like an entire village, and it's this very rich, broad concept.
Yes.
Whereas now in like American society, the concept of family is like the nuclear family.
Yes.
It's incredibly small and atomized.
Yes.
So in bringing this ethic forward, if we were to anchor an ethic of connection in family, would it have to also be something broader to make it?
Well, but that wasn't my thought, right? My thought was we'd shake off the dust of history. There's no reason to bring familism forward. Familism is not good. Familism is evil. It's the real. It's not that the family is evil, but to treat the family as if it were a real object of devotion, as the be-all and end-all, the alpha and omega of our moral life, to my mind, an evil. That's not how we are. Our vocation is to transcend, to go beyond.
I guess to reframe it, do you think part of the reason that idea is so repulsive is because we've shrunk the concept of family down to such a small?
No, I don't think it's just that. If the family were, as you said, the whole village, it might be even more repulsive. I don't think that at all. I think the question that's at stake is transcendence, our infinity. We're not just the puppets of this social world. In our tradition, Christ said, I've come to turn brother against brother. This familism is a heresy for a Christian. And in the West, it's always a heresy. So love for those who are close to us, yes. Veneration for the things that are close to us, no. They're not the source of ultimate value, and they shouldn't be. It's a form of diminishment, right? It's belittlement.
Yes, please.
Can you turn on
Oh,
your
if you could
microphone?
do a microphone, please. Yes, thank you.
Is this okay?
Oh,
Okay,
yes, now it is.
great,
Yes,
great,
thank you.
So, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on how Confucianism aligned with communism, particularly through two lenses of Mao's vision for China and the current Communist Party's vision for China. Because I feel like, from what we read, like it's become more and more part of how the current regime sees it to be aligned with their idealistic and principles. values.
What do you mean by communism? Do you mean the doctrine described by Karl Marx, or do you mean the regime established in China? What do you mean by communism?
That's why, like, the two different lenses of, let's say, mid 1940s to 70s Mao's China, which has, it sort of denounces Confucianism to a large extent, but then the philosophy finds its way back into political thought through the reformulation of communism as seen today through the Communist Party.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, great question. Let me give us a slight bit of history to those of you who may not be familiar with this, because it is both fascinating in itself, but philosophically very relevant. So, beginning next week, we will talk about these two ethics of self-fashioning and the ethics of connection, and will, in a sense, be pitting them against each other by literally saying, from one point of view, what criticisms would it make of the other, from the other point of view, what criticisms would it make of the other, to try to bring out each in its most powerful forms. And I say that to preface my answer to the question, because historically the moments when these have met are not going to be quite at that level, because we're looking at lesser forms of these as we would describe them. Nonetheless, they're often very telling, and telling as to what people perceived at the time when they do come into an encounter. So a very quick history of this, to the backup to Mao's rejection of Confucianism and the current regime's very strong embrace of it in a very particular form. So we mentioned before, very much in passing, that the form that Confucianism takes at the state level under the guise of a Neo-Confucian orthodoxy was an attempted meritocracy, but that meritocracy, as Roberto was alluding to, consisted of, on the one hand, an open access exam system with very severe limitations I'm about to get to, but from their claim, an open access examination system that you could take, and it was graded anonymously, so if you passed, you would gain access to the civil bureaucracy, and the ideal would be that every single position of power, ideally including everything, but they were never able to get rid of the hereditary monarchy, but with that very significant exception, every single position of political power would only be obtainable by someone who was educated, trained on the path we were discussing last week, and therefore hopefully striving to be a good, humane person. Now, those severe limitations are going to be relevant to the question. Number one, the claim was it was open access. However, only males were even allowed to take the exam. So an absolute gender hierarchy that was never seen through. Also, there was never an attempt to build a universal educational system. So you could only even remotely conceivably pass this exam if you were incredibly well educated, which meant if you were born into an elite family, you could get that education. If you were not, often families would literally have to decide which of their children they would have educated, so hopefully they could take the exam. And you can imagine the pressure on that poor child, as well as the feelings of the other children who are not getting that kind of an education. So incredible sets of issues, which means, as Roberto was alluding to, yes, it was a strong claim of meritocracy. However, it also involved all the things we were mentioning last week when we were criticizing this vision of Confucianism, which is it's not really radically overwhelming the social structure. It's simply saying if you're born into an elite family, you also have to be really well educated before you can gain an office. So it's breaking down a hierarchy in a very limited sense. The rest of social hierarchies, gender, class, etc., are really not being broken down by this. All of this is relevant because, absolutely, when the Communist Revolution happens in China, this is one of the critiques. So Mao's move, very much against classical Marxism, was to say the revolution should not be led by the proletariat in urban areas, because in China it was largely still unindustrialized. The revolution should be led by the peasantry, those who were cut out of this system. They are the ones who should be overthrowing the entire existing system, most certainly including the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy, from Mao's reading, and there's a strong piece to which this is true, is really a reproduction of a social elite. Yes, it's an educated elite, but still, it is an elite. And so Mao's call was for the peasantry to overwhelm the bureaucracy, and his vision, you're quite correct to say, from 1949 straight through until his death in the 1970s, his vision is that should be a constant revolution. So even when the Communist Party won and began reforming a successful state, Mao's move in the Cultural Revolution was to call for another revolution. And he said, the party is becoming another imperial bureaucracy, which Mao meant is the ultimate criticism. And so he calls on the people, then mainly the students, to rise up and overthrow his own party. And the claim was, my own party has now become Confucian. And what he meant by Confucian is they've become like the imperial bureaucracy, and it's going to be a self-reproducing elite. And for Mao, that is, of course, unacceptable. So an absolute critique of Confucianism. Now, again, as you're seeing, what he meant by Confucianism is that state-based neo-Confucianism, but that was absolutely his line of critique. Then you get this very intriguing period in China after Mao dies, where China first begins opening up in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s, doesn't just open up, it really fully embraces American-style neoliberalism. And so China starts becoming, well, a lot like America. so you get this extraordinary growth of the economy. You get, for the first time, billionaires emerging in China. You get a level of wealth inequality that's
the largest number of billionaires in the world.
Yeah, by far the largest number of billionaires in the world, unbelievable levels of social and economic inequality. The rural areas are absolutely devastated for the obvious reasons, and this is what happens with neoliberalism. And by the early 2000s, you get a strong critique of that, the fact that China was becoming like a neoliberal America, and a new left begins emerging. And that new left was explicitly Maoist. And one very famous figure he was the main figure running a huge city called Chongqing, called Bo Xilai, he was explicitly a Maoist. Like, you would wake up in the morning and you would see a picture of Bo Xilai, marching into a bank and taking the money from the bank, saying this is controlled by corporate interests and we're going to give the money back to the people. And he would stage parades for himself, but literally based upon Maoist Cultural Revolution songs. And so Mao was coming back very much as a critique of American neoliberalism. And another figure was riding the same wave named Xi Jinping. And unlike Bo Xilai, finally to get back to the heart of your question, Xi Jinping was claiming to be a Maoist. He was also claiming to be a Confucian. And far from this sense of an endless revolution of the people against a new elite, in this case a new capitalist elite, Xi Jinping's vision is, let us recreate the imperial bureaucracy. Let us embrace Confucianism, but as you now can see, this meant neo-Confucianism. And the vision is how we somehow could combine these. His argument was, if we can recreate a meritocratic, bureaucratic state, that meritocratic, bureaucratic state will again, as was true at least in its ideal form in late imperial China, it will be divorced from moneyed interests, whether they be hereditarily or gained through the marketplace. They'll be divorced from moneyed interests. Therefore, the state can stand up to a moneyed elite in a way that the American government is seen as not being able to, because it's controlled by a moneyed elite. And the argument is, by doing so, we could, once again, stand up against the elites, in this case a capitalist elite, especially America, and form a truly neo-Confucian cohesive world in which that bureaucratic elite would break down economic and social inequality at a level that America cannot. It can deal with world problems like climate change at a level that America cannot, because it's too controlled by corporate interests. And hence, the claim was that neo-Confucian version brought into the modern world would therefore be the equivalent of what Mao was hoping to do through a permanent revolution, but by the exact opposite means. So you would have a Confucian form of Maoism, two more radically different ideologies it's difficult to imagine, and yet that is very much the claim of Xi Jinping in current China. And this underlines Roberto's earlier statement
You
that
would also say a few words about the attempt to promote Confucianism in China and the network of Confucius Institutes.
Oh,
And even with the
absolutely.
participation of some Harvard professors.
Indeed, indeed. And so part of the claim of this marriage of Maoism with Neo-Confucianism, the argument was this would also be the gift that China would bring to the world, because this would not only renew China and break down neoliberal 1990s China, it would be a new vision for world governance. So unlike the American vision, which was being read as being a continuation of the British Empire, so the claim is the British Empire was a so-called free enterprise zone for the world, but really one that just enhanced the imperial power, namely Britain. The argument was America is basically just continuing that exact same system, so the whole neoliberal order is simply a continuation of the British imperial system. And the further claim of Xi Jinping is China, as it reaches the point of becoming a major world power, it will break this imperial system that was begun by Britain and now continuing by America, and it will offer what it was calling and still is calling the China model to the world, saying this model that we are developing of a strong bureaucratic, meritocratic state that can take control over moneyed interests and prevent corporate and moneyed interests from controlling the state, that is the vision that should be adopted around the world. And this then took the form, to get back to Roberto's question, of strongly pushing this vision of what China was doing, and therefore that vision of Chinese history, namely that Neo-Confucianism was the great moment of China now being brought into the modern world by current China. And China then created a number of, and this is literally the name, Confucius Institutes that were extremely well funded. They would go to universities around the world and say, if you will team up with us, we will have a Confucius Institute. We, for free, will teach the Chinese language. We will teach Chinese culture from the perspective I've just mentioned. All of this for free, so to a university, you don't have to fund a Chinese language program. You don't have to fund courses in Chinese civilization. We'll do it for you. And this was extremely well funded, and you won't be surprised to hear a number of universities around the world very, very actively embrace this. Indeed, a number
And
of
what was
professors,
the
yes.
version of Confucianism promoted by our former colleague Du Ming?
Yes, and we had a scholar here, Du Ming was his name, who was very strongly in support of this, calling for a Confucian view of the world that should be adopted throughout the world, including very much in America. The reason Du Ming is no longer a colleague with us is he left for Beijing with the hope of, well, he did create an institute, but his hope was to create an institute that would be kind of a think tank for this version of Neo-Confucianism, both developing China, but also actively being promoted for a new vision for world governance throughout all the nation states of the world, ultimately that would break the nation state system. So it was very, very powerfully being pushed. Now, there's been a strong pushback against that. So a lot of these Confucius institutes have disappeared, and China's realized it was not the most successful attempt to give that vision to the world. However, the attempt was very telling. This was not seen as simply a rethinking of China. It was an active attempt to say, we are going to push aside this entire American neoliberal order and give to the world a radically different, and the claim was much, much better vision of how to run a state, how to think about meritocracy, and how to control a capitalist system.
But don't you think almost all of that was a sideshow? As I spent a week in the party school in Beijing. The Communist Party of China has a school for the formation of cadres. And the school is an important vehicle because it forms it propagates the ideology of the party.
Yes.
Xi Jinping, in an earlier stage of his career, was director of the party school.
Absolutely.
I thought, so during the week that I spent there, they were discussing the ideas of American economists. of second and third rate American social scientists. The only person who referred to the ideas of Karl Marx there was me. I was the only person who invoked the name of Marx. And it was very reminiscent of my experience in my own country, in Brazil.
Yes.
I said, this is mental colonialism. So great China, with this enormous claim to the attention of humanity, wealth, power, in the realm of ideas, was being led by this faint echo of Western ideas. No distinguished Western thinkers. Second and third rate texts of American technocrats and economists. That was the reality. And all this stuff about Confucianism and so forth, it's kind of sideshow. This is the icing in the cake. It's the sugar coating. It's not what they talk about.
And on that point, let me also say, and I think that I would expand the point to Maoism too. So yes, at the Central Party School, you don't learn a lot about Karl Marx, you don't learn a lot about Mao, you don't really learn a lot about Neo-Confucianism, so that is absolutely true. However, there's something here very interesting, and I think telling for our larger discussions. So I mentioned the claim is we will reform a meritocratic bureaucracy like that existed in late imperial China. And we mentioned very briefly what that looked like. So you may plausibly be wondering, what is it now? There's no civil service exam. So let me tell you what it is now and why the Central Party School is what it is. It's all very telling for the way this is working out right now. So the claim to meritocracy right now in China is based primarily on a single exam called the Gaokao, like literally means the high exam. And the high exam is taken by everyone in China who has any hopes of going to college. And it is the one and only basis by which you will be placed in a college. So there are no letters of recommendation, there are no grades that have any impact on this. How well you do on this one exam will place you. And it is done anonymously, so the claim is it's a pure meritocracy. No matter how wealthy a family you're from, it doesn't matter. Whoever is letting you in is never going to know that you're from a powerful family. It's simply a grade. But of course, obviously, to do well on this, you have to be very, very well educated. And the way this works out in practice is literally you will take it, you will get a grade, and then you are placed in the ranked colleges by how well you did. So the #1 college is Tsinghua. And so there's Tsinghua, there's Beijing University, there's Fudan in Shanghai, there's a ranked list. And to get there, you have to, of course, do incredibly well in the Gaokao. You also have been tracked from a very young age. So the further claim of the meritocracy is if you're from a very poor rural area and you start testing well at a young age, that won't get you into college, but if you're testing well at a young age, you are tracked and moved into ever better colleges. So, ever better, K through 12, what we would call K through 12 schools. So it is, by any standard in that specific sense, much more meritocratic than exists in America, because absolutely you will, on the Tsinghua campus, you'll meet people from very, very poor rural areas because they were tracked at a young age by doing well on tests, and kabam, they do very well on the Gaokao. Then, let me continue the story. So, for those students who make Tsinghua, the #1 school in China, those are the ones who tested best on the Gaokao. Tsinghua is an engineering school, and the top tier students who are going to Tsinghua are engineering students, and the Gaokao is very heavily weighted toward engineering, so math, sciences, engineering. And those who then at Tsinghua get the top tier grades at Tsinghua University, the top tier school, the party will then go to them and say, would you like to join? And still in China, and this is very much a remnant of the late imperial period, one of the highest callings is to serve in the bureaucracy. That was absolutely true in late imperial China. That is very much the case now too. And so many of the people who are so asked will indeed join. And what you do is you're often an engineer, and you then go to the Central Party School. And the goal of the Central Party School is to take these group of people who are almost across the board engineers with very, very few exceptions and train them in basic things like economics, all the things that they oftentimes did not take many courses, if any at all, throughout their entire schooling. And the idea is you are now going to engineer the social world, but instead of just building bridges, which they, obviously the party does a lot of, so it's huge into building powerful infrastructure. It has probably the best train system in the world, et cetera. But you're asked to think about economics as an engineering problem. So it's not the idea that markets are free and we should let the market run things. The idea is, no, the state creates markets. I think this is true, by the way, but their vision of it is states create markets, so think of it as an engineering problem. What kind of a market do you want to create? So absolutely, they will read Milton Friedman, they will read Keynes, and they treat them as engineering problems. What kind of an economy was Keynes trying to create? Create being a strong verb here, and intentionally used. What kind of an economy was Friedman trying to create? Not Friedman was deregulating to allow the market to be free. The vision is, no. Friedman was creating an economy. America chose to embrace that. Were they right? And so it's the whole Central Party school. You don't learn a lot about Marx. You don't learn a lot about Confucius. What you learn a ton about is how to think about the social world as an engineering problem. And so that's the current form of meritocracy. And I might add, this is quite unique in the world right now. If you look at the political class across the world, almost without exception, America very much included, most politicians are lawyers. That's where the political class comes from. In China, with very few exceptions, they're engineers. And it very much affects what is really going on in China, and I think Roberto's right. It's the ideology of Maoism, the ideology of Confucianism is less significant than the fact that these are engineers. The claim to late imperial China really comes from this vision of meritocracy, which now is being redone in the system I just mentioned. So a long answer to the question, but one that opened up lots and lots of very significant issues. Thank you. Yes, please.
A little bit of a non sequitur, but I was wondering, so I'm really interested by this idea of imagination practices as the generation of the source of heat in a society instead of the kindling being the family and that spilling out. Could you talk about some of the practical pathways through which this imagination occurs?
Well, so it's really not the topic of this course, right? So let's go back to the idea of world revolution. So I said, the world's on fire for 300 years, and there's a revolutionary project. The revolutionary project has two sides. One side is political. It's carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, socialism, and its promise is to lift the grid of entrenched division and hierarchy weighing on social life. The other side is personalist. And its main carrier in the world is the worldwide popular romantic culture. The film, the movie, the soap opera, the TV series. And it's projecting into every slum in Brazil and every village of India the sublime message that the ordinary person is not so ordinary after all and can ascend to a higher form of life. And the claim that I made is this revolutionary project remains the most powerful project in the world because all the other projects, it has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. So in that sense, it's still in command of the agenda, but it's now also paradoxically weak because its votaries, its adepts no longer know what its next steps should be. Either on the political side or on the personalist side. This course here is mainly about the next steps on the personalist side. So politics comes in because the division between the moral and the political is only relative. But it's not the main subject. So the answer to your question would require then an exploration of the institutional alternatives. The alternative form of education, the alternative form of production, the alternative form of democracy. And that's a subject in which I'm passionately interested. But it's not the subject which we've chosen here to put at the center. So the answer is a different form of education, a different, a form of market, a reinvention of the market order, which does not pin the market to a single dogmatic version of itself. So, looking to the future, since we can't deal with the institutional details or stages, what's the regime that I imagine for the future for the market? I would call it capitalism without capitalists. Most of the resources of society should be put in the hands of funds that don't belong to anyone. They're not the state or an individual. They're administered under rules, and they auction off the productive resources of society to whoever can use them most effectively. A regime of permanent capital rotation. So no one has property perpetually. People have it to the extent they can use it most efficiently. Now, I think that the traditional property right should always exist because it has a priceless advantage, which is that it allows someone, the owner, to do at his own risk something that no one else believes in. And we would always want that. But what we should not desire is for the market order to be represented by only one version of economic decentralization. In democracy, we have only these weak democracies. We would want a high energy democracy, by which I mean a high level of popular mobilization, rapid resolution of impasse, combination of strong central action with the ability of parts of a country to deviate. So a democracy that doesn't require war or ruin as the conditions of change, that's organized to allow us all to become what I described, insiders and outsiders at the same time. A radically different form of education in which the main theme of education is the understanding of change, because to understand anything is to understand how it changes. And we need the analytic capacities that have to do with the interpretation of change. To do that, we have to sacrifice encyclopedic superficiality, encyclopedic scope, and have a form of education that emphasizes selective deepening, thematic or project-oriented. And it should be dialectical. So nothing should be taught just once. Everything should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. So what I imagine are a series of institutional and cultural innovations, the convergent effect of which is to liberate the genius of ordinary humanity, our power of invention. That's the subject that's being invoked. But now, if we are to transpose this to a real discussion, we have to deal with the details. And it's never possible to do that without having a lot of time. So Goethe said, whenever you write something or do something, people will say, where's the rest? So the rest requires devotion, time. Why don't you, Michael, criticize and carry forward the discussion?
Absolutely. Let me say a few more words. So one thing I would like to say a few words about is I mentioned part of what's intriguing is when these different visions have met in the past, and we've noted the way that right now, despite what you would hope might be going on it's really not. So with the Central Party School, it's not that people are debating these issues that we're discussing in the class. It's really how do engineers think about how to engineer the economy. However, it's still an intriguing moment when these ideas are sort of being played with. Let me say a few more words about an earlier time too, because it too, arguably even more so, will highlight some intriguing issues that we'll be then picking up in much more detail next week when we look at these two ideas in their strongest form and how we will play them off against each other. But let me say a few more words about that earlier moment when these two visions, in the forms they took in Europe and China respectively, met, and the implications of the ways that's played out. It's much of what we call the world, the modern world, in part comes out of that encounter. And I would say, very much in agreement with Roberto, the readings that came out of that were not the most powerful, to say the least. So, among the first times that these two ideologies came in contact with each other was when Jesuits were sent to China. And as many of you know, the Jesuit order was a missionary order. However, it was a missionary order that was absolutely committed to learning the languages and cultures of the areas they went to. In this case, therefore, it meant you actually had Jesuits who learned classical Chinese. They actually were reading fluently, not only the classics themselves, but all the entire commentarial tradition of the classics to try to understand it and work in what the implications would be for the rituals, in this case, those in place in China, and
they had a characteristic strategy, which is to influence the elites
absolutely.
in every country that they went to.
Absolutely, and exclusively the elites. I mean, this is, they were at the courts learning classical Chinese and working entirely for the elites. They then, and that's another piece of it that I won't touch on here, is what they decided about the ritual system, but it may come up next week. However, they also then started writing accounts about China that were read in Europe. And beginning in the 17th century, these made an incredible impact because for the first time, people in Europe began hearing about these ideas and the institutional practices that they were being developed in and during late imperial China. And in particular, this issue of meritocracy became huge. This is still a period when, as we've mentioned before, in Europe, almost all positions of power, with almost no exceptions, are defined exclusively in terms of birth. So the entire social hierarchy of Europe was defined by birth. If you were born an aristocrat, or what level of the aristocracy, it would define where you would be, how much power you would have for the rest of your life, and all the way down to the peasantry, who would simply work the fields for the aristocracy. There was almost no social mobility of any kind. Everything was based entirely upon heredity. And suddenly in the 17th century, you start getting these Jesuit accounts of the world we just mentioned, where for all of the severe limitations that we've noted, still, here you actually have a bureaucratic state. I'd even call the things that existed in the 17th century Europe states would be really pushing our definition of the term. And these were strong bureaucratic states manned entirely, with the one exception of the hereditary monarch, but otherwise manned entirely by an educated elite. This was just unbelievable. And the fact that anyone could take the exam, again, it had to be male, and you obviously had no chance of passing it without being educated, incredibly well educated, but the fact that anyone could was extraordinary. So there are examples of people who were Korean, they learned classical Chinese, they would take the exam, they would pass it, and they would work their way up the bureaucracy. So no sense of ethnicity being a limitation, because we're all born messes at birth, and it's just a question of training, and those who are well trained by this way of thinking should take the exam and prove it. And so this made an incredible impact to the point where by the 18th century, you get the Enlightenment figures, and I'll just use Voltaire as an example, said, we could do this too. We too could actually create a meritocratic world where we would be run by an educated elite, not by an hereditary elite. Then we could actually have states that would actually be managing things. And this was his vision of an enlightened order, which he saw as being China. And then things get particularly intriguing when, as you move into the 19th century, you get attempts to follow the civil service exam in very limited ways in Europe, but very telling ways. So for the first time, you start getting attempts at meritocratic exams being created, and we live and breathe the implications of this system. Because the key shift that occurs when it moves from China to Europe was we're not simply is a too weak a way of putting it, we are not at all following a vision that everyone is an equal mess at birth and what you are depends upon your training and education, and we're testing for that. The vision is, no, this is still very much following the Greek structure of being that we've been noting. Every single human being at birth has an inherent level of intelligence, and we're testing that. We're trying to find out who amongst us is more intelligent than other people, which has nothing to do with education. We're testing intelligence. And that was the claim of the tests as they began developing in the 19th century. And to jump a century, moving it closer to our times, when the SAT, which many of you who went through the K through 12 system in America had to take, the SAT was developed on the same ideology. The claim of the SAT is not that we're training your educational level, your training level, we are testing your inherent intelligence. That was the claim. Now, I'm happy to say the SAT has finally dropped that claim. However, it still undergirds the way they think about the test. And so the claim is all of us at birth have different levels of intelligence. The SAT it's only meritocratic in the limited sense. The claim is that we're finding those people who may not have been born into wealthy families, but who are nonetheless inherently intelligent. So it's the complete opposite of the whole vision that was coming out of the Confucian tradition. And when we in America claim to have a meritocracy, it's often criticized for not being very meritocratic because there's almost no social mobility in America. But of course, from the perspective of the ethic of connection, the critique would be even stronger, which is to say, even if the so-called meritocratic techniques in America honestly worked, it's the wrong vision of meritocracy anyway. Because if you're building a testing system on the claim that people at birth are already a certain thing, exactly like we also have in our personality test. There are a limited number of personality types, and you take the test to see what you are and what your careers are. Everyone, therefore, has an inherent level of intelligence, an inherent possibility in terms of what you can be as a human being. As long as you have that as the vision, it's not just that we don't fully follow the implications of the meritocratic possibilities, it's that that's a vision of meritocracy that is unbelievably deadening. And I mention all of this to say, in terms of these debates, both the strong form of a vision of self-fashioning and an ethic of connection should find the current system that exists in America horrifying, right?
There's
it is
an
absolutely
undercurrent-
horrifying.
There's an undercurrent theme here in this rather surprising detour that we're taking, which is the human reality of the academic elites in these countries.
Yes.
So in China, we saw there were a bunch of engineers
Yes.
who may have come from the countryside and now they're at the top because
They're
of
running cities.
narrow
Absolutely.
meritocracy. And what ideas can they have about the society? Now, look at the United States. So the economics departments of the American research universities, the elite universities, now have a stranglehold on the discipline worldwide.
Completely.
Now, do you know what the typical profile of a young American professor of economics is now? I'll tell you. So the typical profile is a whiz kid from the Midwest who did very well in mathematics at his public high school. Then he comes to Harvard and he enrolls in the Harvard Mathematics Department. The Harvard Mathematics Department is interested only in people who may consider mathematical geniuses. So the department, after a year or two, the department decides this kid is not a genius. So he then transfers from mathematics to applied mathematics. And he continues for another 2 years in applied mathematics. then they decide, well, he's really nothing special in applied mathematics. He just seemed to be clever when he was in Kansas, but we don't think he's anything special. So that kid then goes and applies to the doctoral program in economics at Harvard. So in recent years, from what I understand, Harvard didn't accept any concentrator in Harvard College in economics. None, zero. So their typical profile is something like applied mathematics. So then he becomes a professor of economics. So what can you expect from someone like that? I mean, it's only by some extraordinary oddity, some rupture of the ordinary, that there could be an inspiration or a rebellion. And those are the people who are now providing the guiding ideas to the world.
Yes, absolutely. That defines social
the
policy
typical
for the
profile of
world.
this kid has now become a professor of economics. What is he? He's a failed mathematician. And so in economics, has this reverence for mathematics. Then you look at the mathematics. The mathematicians, we consider it's toy mathematics, because basically no mathematics is used in economics that was invented after the middle of the 19th century. And it's not because they're not smart enough to use other mathematics. It's because the mathematics that they do that comes from the marginalist tradition basically uses only deductive reasoning. So there's no use in economics as it now exists for mathematics like the mathematics that the physicists use. So it's extraordinarily narrow horizon of complete lack of, they're just lost in the world. And these people they know nothing about the history of economic theory. They have no understanding of the history of their own discipline. So that's the problem, the human reality. So where it's describing these large projects, who's going to implement them? Who's going to advance them? Yes. And look at what happens in the world. Karl Marx, who now is described as the greatest European philosopher by the European public in polls that they conduct, was unable to get any job in the academy. He published Das Kapital. In the first 20 years after Das Kapital was published, it sold 200 copies. So the world's very strange. And the career of ideas in the world is mysterious.
Yes.
It sold 200 copies for 20 years, and then you look a little later and the whole world is on fire. How did it happen? What happened in between, right?
No, it is absolutely fascinating and so telling the degree to which the educational world and the rewards of education and the social worlds that are built out of those rewards of education, in other words, who makes it where and the kind of power they're given, it is amazing the degree to which they are based upon. We keep talking about giving the most powerful readings of these ideas. I don't think it's going too far to say it's among the worst conceivable readings of these ideas that are the ones that really define our educational systems around the world today. So in terms of going back to the question of what we would do, one very concrete place is education. If you can imagine an education trying to take these two ideas, not just these two ideas, I say these two ideas because they're the ones we're focusing on at this stage in the course, but taking them seriously in terms of what it would mean to open up the imagination in the different ways, but powerful in each case, that each would be trying to do so, and then asking concretely, what would such an educational set of practices look like? How could you then develop a different world of ideas by implication from that? And what kinds of worlds could we start building from that? Is that a doable problem to begin solving? The answer is yes, not to imply it's going to be easy, given the educational systems that now exist, but that is absolutely doable. I mean, needless to say, we're trying to do so in a very tiny, limited way in this one course, and we're deeply grateful that you're willing to be on the journey with us. But imagine if in the pre-college level, which is much more formative for human beings and what in America is called the K through 12, imagine if we rethought the educational system, taking these ideas seriously and asking, what would it mean in practice for students to be truly learning through imagination to rethink the world around them? That would be absolutely extraordinary. And when we like to think, well, maybe we're not fully living up to our meritocratic ideals, but at least the ideals are good, I think both of us would say, no, the current way meritocracy is being defined is unbelievably limiting. Like, even calling it unbelievably limiting is, if anything, too weak a critique. It's deadening, absolutely deadening. It's not just that we're not living up to those ideals, the ideals themselves are ridiculous. So what would it mean to truly do it? And concretely, that is a place where we really could begin. Yes, please.
As a guy from China, I might add, for education in China, it's like super cheap compared to America. Our like undergraduate fee for a year is more around 500 to 600 a year.
Yes.
From the toppest
Yes.
universities to the college in like local area, it's affordable for like almost everyone, so that the people in China like me can go to college, choose whatever I want to study, and not worry about my like student loans and
Exactly.
everything. I think the affordable for education is also very important to that subject. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you. And you are absolutely right to bring this to the class, because that's another key aspect of the educational system in China. It's, as we've noted, it's attempting as much as possible within that definition to not limit educational opportunities to an hereditary or moneyed elite. Another key aspect is this: even in America, if, in the limited form of meritocracy that exists, one makes it into a top-tier school, exactly as you say, you have to take on so many loans, it predefines what you can possibly study and what your possible careers are, because you have to pay off your loans. Exactly. And in China, absolutely, there is an incredible state push toward the importance of education. It's an incredible educational system. I mean, we've mentioned the limitations, but it is absolutely true. No matter where you were born, you will have access to excellent education, and all the way to the very top, the cost is minimal, which means you don't have to think, okay, since I will be burdened with hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans for the rest of my life, what do I have to major in, or in Harvard, so we say concentrate in order to get a career that will allow me to pay off the loans? And China very wisely takes that off the table. And that is a very concrete, doable thing that China, to their great credit, has done. Yes. Yes, please.
I work at MIT with a team of researchers on an area known as cold fusion that used to be not taken very seriously by the physics community, but we now have DOE support, Department of Energy support, and it's really taking off. My experience is that there's a huge difference in the reception of ideas depending on personality. One of my favorite papers about the philosophy of science is by a psychology professor called "Why Are Modern Scientists So Dull?" And it's
Why modern science?
Why are modern scientists so dull?
and the argument is that the institutions of science today select their bias towards conscientiousness and against openness, which are two dimensions of personality that are often anti-correlated. And so my experience is that you find a lot of ideas that people are uncomfortable with are the interesting ideas, but in academia establishment, you have a hard time for them to find root. But then what's interesting is, especially in the US, there's now kind of a parallel movement, sort of the meta-science or progress movement, where some of these scientists just quit academia and find themselves in other alternative organizations. So there's a $100 million incubator in Boston called Convergent Research, where basically people do these nonprofit science startups. And I think that's a great example of institutional experimentation, right? Which I think Professor Unger has argued for, that we at some point say, look, this system doesn't work anymore. We need to be creative in trying to find other ways of doing science. And so I hope this will continue, but I just want to say there is some hope there, but there's also some concerns with the status quo, and especially I think personality types are difficult to change and transcend, and I think they're maybe some of the biggest obstacles here.
Yes, thank you for bringing this to the table, and let me just underline its significance by giving another example. One might think that, well, one great place where ideas could flourish would be, well, the American university system, not just in sciences, but in general, because here's this extraordinary institutional push that has been created, namely that people are given tenure for life, guaranteed tenure, so they can think the most extraordinary thoughts possible. And they're given freedom to do so. You would think out of this would come the most brilliant, stunning thinking. I won't even say imaginable. It would push our sense of what the imagination could do. Look around you at the American university system. Why is that not occurring? And it's in part related to exactly this, because I'll just give you a personal example. When I was hired, I was explicitly told, now, Michael, you will get tenure or not in several years, depending on what the immediate people in your specialized field write about you. So you are convincing that limited number of people that you are not a big thinker, that you can work across fields, rethink fields, the exact opposite, because they'll never write in your favor. You're teaching them that. Yes, you are this very, very conservative person who's not trying to rethink anything and trying to work out your niche in a very small piece of the field. And then the argument was, okay, but at least after a few years, once you get tenure, then you can think big. But the problem is exactly the one you mentioned. Once people spend 6, 7, 8 years of their life, if not much longer, depending on how long you're in what are called postdoctoral positions, you spend that much time doing the most narrow work to convince 12 people around the world in your immediate field that you're a good conservative scholar in that little definition of it. By the time you get tenure, yeah, you are habituated, to use a term very powerful in the Confucian tradition, into an incredibly limited way of thinking. So then you get tenure, sure, theoretically you can do anything, you can think big, you can read across the field, you can read across global philosophy. No one does it, and they don't do it for the exact reason you mentioned. So it isn't just that we need to change the institutional structures, which we desperately need to do, but we need to also change the entire culture of ideas and worlds of ideas such that this extraordinary possibility would actually be realized when in practice it is not at all realized in terms of what people actually do. So thank you, it's a wonderful example. And on that depressing note, let me look forward in a hopefully more optimistic version of this. So as we've mentioned in passing, our next class will be devoted to taking these two ethics, the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, and the ethic of connection. And now that we have tried to give each in its most powerful form, we will try to push that by asking what happens when, in their most powerful form that we've yet been able to articulate, hopefully that's not the end of it, when we begin putting them together. And if it is not going to be possible, and we will argue it's not, to come up with an easy synthesis, because that would actually destroy the most powerful sides of each, how do we, in a sense, push each against the other to help rethink both the powers and limitations of the other, and use that to continue this work of giving the most powerful articulation of them and thinking through their implications. So I look forward to next week when we continue this conversation. Meanwhile, thank you so much for, as always, a very exciting discussion, and we very much look forward to next week. Thank you.
Michael, why don't you think they took the prompt of engaging more?
Exactly, especially with your closing on temperament. That was so powerful. I was so surprised that wasn't the focus of the next hour. Exactly. But let's bring that up again next week, because the issue of temperament is crucial. And it's, as you said, both of these ethics would hate the degree to which we were defined by our temperament. Yeah. So it's actually something let's bring up again as a theme next week. Yes.
Well, it's not just that. There's a whole argument I made about this ethic and its transformation.
Exactly. But we will continue it next week as we push pit each against the other, so hopefully that will provoke it. Great, welcome back, welcome back. Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope you're feeling better. Wonderful, wonderful.
You didn't know what? I'm not going to say that.
Wonderful. See you next week. Yeah, please.
Hello.
Yes, great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, about your final paper. Yes, it sounds very exciting. So yes, run with it. Run with it. Yes. Oh no! It sounds very exciting. So what we're looking for are exciting, big, unanswerable questions, and boy, does this fit the bill? so fitting the bad verses. So yes.
Kids that went to applied math and economics that we spoke about. So, apply what I discussed here to
Yes, it sounds very exciting. Yes. So run with it.
Where are you now? In what field?
Yes.
One really cool is high school in Tsinghua. I got my master's degree in Tsinghua. It's really cool. But I've seen that.
So yes, so email.
for the rest of
Thank you.
I was wondering if
Yeah, we'll walk back tomorrow.
I'll meet you there.
I have to go to a faculty meeting a little later, but I can speak with you for a little bit.
Okay, sounds great. I'll meet you there.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
sure.
Fantastic. I look forward to talking to you soon.
Hello.
I'm in economics undergrad, so I was very interested in what you had to say about your alternative view. Yeah, but the problem is, so the only difference I was just wondering, are there any meetings that you were informed by, is it mostly coming from Marxists?
Well, no, I don't think so.